webpage. So thank you everyone so much for joining us today to hear about policy resources for climate adaptation funding barriers experienced by Northwest coastal tribes. We're going to give a little background on the story of these products, why these were created, and then the authors of there's a suite of resources, so the authors of each will walk you through what's available in each of them, and we'll talk a little bit about the future of this work. So the Tribal Coastal Resilience Project worked to support the climate readiness of Northwest coastal tribes by centering coastal tribal priorities and participation in climate adaptation, by providing information to tribes and to non-tribal partners to advance climate resilience, and by enhancing capacity for addressing the climate risks and needs of coastal tribes. This project was a collaborative effort of tribal and non-tribal partners. It was co-led by the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington and by the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians with partners Washington Sea Grant and Western Washington University. The project was a part of the Northwest Climate Resilience Collaborative, which was a NOAA Climate Adaptation Partnership Program. In August of 2024, the project released a report describing climate adaptation barriers and needs experienced by Northwest coastal tribes. This assessment was based on a series of listening sessions that we held with Northwest coastal tribes, including tribal staff, community members, and elected officials. And the report identified a broad suite of barriers experienced by coastal tribes in their climate adaptation work, as well as many successes. But in the suite of barriers that we heard from the tribes, the most challenging among them by far was funding. Participants in listening sessions described funding for climate adaptation, particularly from the federal government, as being insufficient relative to tribal needs, as being difficult to access and administer, which takes precious time of tribal staff away from other important work and resources of other tribal government functions. And funding, and particularly federal funding, was often driven by the priorities of the funder, resulting in misalignment with tribal priorities. We also identified needs for addressing those barriers. Those needs include a considerable increase in the amount of available funding to meet the scale of adaptation required by coastal tribes, more generalized and flexible sources of funding to maximize tribal autonomy and responsiveness in allocating funds and to reduce administrative burdens, more long-term funding to make applying for funding and supporting efforts associated with new funding, like hiring staff, worth the effort, and to minimize disruptions to adaptation activities due to a lack of funding continuity. Fewer stringent qualification requirements, including less burdensome match or personnel requirements to help make funding more accessible to tribes. And finally, funding that is better aligned with tribal priorities rather than the priorities of funding entities to support community-driven priorities and the incorporation of Indigenous knowledges. After we released the report, we partnered with legal and policy experts from the Native American Law Center at the University of Washington School of Law and the Environmental and Energy Law Program at Harvard Law School and the Environmental Policy Innovation Center to help identify potential policy solutions to address key funding barriers that we identified in the report. Together, we developed 3 complementary products to support funding of tribal climate resilience efforts. The first is a primer on the use of FEMA funds to support tribal climate resilience. The second is a series of policy memos on flexible funding authorities to support tribal climate adaptation. And the third is a table of funding opportunities for tribal adaptation that highlights common barriers. So tribal partners provided critical iterative feedback to ensure that these products reflected their experience and expertise and priorities. This included scoping of this project and these products with a tribal advisory group, an in-person workshop with tribal staff, citizens, and elected officials that was held at an affiliated Tribes Northwest Indians convention, and then targeted one-on-one interviews with tribal partners. So now I'm going to hand it over to each of the lead authors of these policy tools to walk us through their products and how they can be used by tribal and non-tribal partners to reduce funding barriers to tribal adaptation. Starting with Hannah Perls.
Thanks, Meade. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Perls. My pronouns are she, her. I am a former senior staff attorney with a think tank at Harvard Law School called the Environmental Energy Law Program. And my co-author on this report, I am incredibly honored to say, was Kelby Kennedy. She's an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and was the former National Tribal Affairs Advocate, the first ever at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, under the Biden administration. And I should say both Kelby and I, Kelby, she was joining, we're presenting now in our personal capacity and in no way representing the viewpoints of our current employers. Maybe next slide. So we focused on FEMA funding in particular in response to the needs that Meade identified, because FEMA funding, unlike congressional appropriations, unlike one-off grant programs, can be an incredibly flexible mechanism that can support tribal adaptation needs. And especially after FEMA revised its policies specific to tribal nations in December 2024, we thought that there was an opportunity to clarify how those policies apply to tribal nations, in particular, discuss the pros and cons of the different avenues that are available to accessing FEMA funding and making sure that that information was readily available to folks. So our goal with this document is to provide a clear and easy to use resource to help tribal leaders and staff decide if and how to seek federal disaster assistance. Next slide. And we designed the resource as a Q&A that responds directly to questions that were raised by tribal partners during those iterative sessions that Meade mentioned. And this includes, but is not limited to, what types of events qualify for federal disaster assistance? What are the 3 types of declarations tribal nations can seek? There are 3 different types of declaration requests, and each of those requests has different pros and cons. How can tribes partner on disaster declaration requests? This was a really important and common question, including not just how federally recognized tribes can partner, but can those federally recognized tribes partner with state recognized tribes or even unrecognized Indigenous communities when they're putting together these declaration requests? How can tribal nations decrease the non-federal cost share for disaster assistance? And finally, how do recent changes in federal policy under the Trump administration affect these pros and cons that we discussed throughout the report? How do they affect that choice, whether to pursue federal assistance and through what mechanisms? And if you dig into the PDF, which I encourage you to do, you'll see that we also organize the report using these color-coded identifiers to really call out what we feel are important opportunities or flags for folks if you're just skimming through the report. The first is opportunities for intergovernmental coordination. So these are recommendations for, I think most importantly, ensure that tribal sovereignty continues to be honored and respected throughout the process. So what are the things that you can do? What are the people that you need to contact to form those relationships to make sure the boxes are checked so that that sovereignty is honored? The second is this red box with the arrows, and this highlights significant changes under the Trump administration to federal policy at the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA that, again, might change a tribe's calculus as to whether or not it seeks a declaration and how it goes about doing that. And the third, and I think the most exciting, are these blue sky action items. So for those of you who are familiar with FEMA's process, a declaration request can only be submitted after a major event, but we wanted to make sure to highlight a lot of the really important actions that a tribal government can take before disaster hits to then make the process of seeking disaster assistance much smoother. And I think that's it for this piece. So Meade, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, I'm actually going to turn it right back over to Professor Monte Mills and Sydney Anderson.
Thanks, Meade. Morning, everybody. Great to see you. I'm Monte Mills, director of the Native American Law Center. I had the honor of working on this project along with Lauren Young, a graduate of our school, and some other recent graduates here from the law school. I also had the privilege of working with Sydney, who we're going to share our description of these projects, but I'll turn it over to Sydney to introduce herself.
Thanks, Monty. Hi, everyone. I'm Sydney. I worked on this project in my capacity as the Tribal Legal Fellow at Environmental Policy Innovation Center. I'm a Tlingit tribal citizen and was thrilled to get to join this project and work with the UW team and everyone at Harvard and, of course, the Tribal Climate Resilience Project.
Next, Meade. So, as you heard Meade say from the report, the barriers around funding were identified, and the disaster declaration part of it that Hannah just talked about sought to address some of those barriers within the context of disaster declarations. Our focus was really existing and potential new or expanded or modified pathways to enable more flexible federal funding in particular, and also to empower and support understanding, particularly on behalf of tribal communities, about the existing pathways for accessing funds to support climate resilience work, natural resources work, et cetera. And so you can see how from the goal, identifying these flexible funding authorities, we also tried to think about ways in which the practical limitations of those existing authorities could be overcome. Now, I want to say, just as a caveat here, a couple of things. One, there are many folks I'm sure in attendance here and many folks who we heard from through working with our partners who expressed incredible frustration with the barriers that were described in the report and that sort of continue to present challenges, particularly around flexible funding and especially around enabling and empowering tribes to secure funding for their own priorities as opposed to those identified as priorities by the funding agencies. And while I don't think our report offers any magic solutions that in an instant are going to change that framework, we're hopeful that through a couple of different resources, we can support consideration and those who want to advocate for expanding and providing more flexible funding resources. That's really the first product that we're going to talk about. We've also provided more resources around existing authorities, in particular the 477 lending program and leasing program that Sydney's going to talk a little bit more about. And then we provided specific focus on the use of Public Law 93-638 and self-governance contracting and compacting as an avenue that could be used now and also could be expanded further to provide more flexible funding that is much more responsive to the sovereign needs of tribal nations. And Sydney's going to talk a little bit about her excellent work to sort of map out how those funds have been used historically and the ways in which tribal nations and their partners might think about leveraging that resource going forward. The only other thing I wanted to say, just as a matter of a caveat, is that over the time, and you heard Hannah just refer to this a little bit in the context of disaster declarations, it's really it has been a challenging time, I think, to consider the access to and ability to utilize federal funds in particular over the course of the last year and the policy changes and funding cuts and staffing shortages that have been implemented by the current administration. And so while I think we've provided these resources and developed them as a way, hopefully, to provide a solid and stable platform going forward and opportunities for further expansion. I think we heard loud and clear and also recognized that the practical challenges around the current state of funding, particularly from federal partners, is extremely challenging. And I think that made all of our work on all of these products over the course of the last 12 to 14 months particularly meaningful, but also especially challenging in that regard. So with that, Meade, next, please. So as we talked about, there are sort of three different aspects to this portion of our work. And what I mentioned first is sort of examples and ways in which expanding the flexibility and the authority for federal funding to pass to tribes more efficiently and more easily was really the first objective, and represents the work done in our first memo, which are really examples and ideas, sort of ways in which folks might think about expanding current authorities. And we identified three that we really focused on. One is existing legislation that's been introduced, has been supported by tribal nations, particularly here in the Northwest, that really focuses on the need for greater funding and more funding flexibility as it relates to, in particular, environmental challenges, climate resilience, et cetera. And that's the Tribal Environmental Resiliency Resources Act, or the TERRA Act. It's introduced right now as HR 7859 in the House of Representatives. There were hearings on it, subcommittee hearings on it last fall. And we offer this not because it is a be all end all perfect solution to all of the problems, but it represents an example of the types of policy changes that could support greater flexibility that is much more responsive to environmental considerations being raised by tribal nations. And from the legislative hearings and the records that have already been developed around this legislation, you can see the tribal nations' position and the concerns that have been raised in this regard. So the TERRA Act provides one example. Secondly, and we'll talk much more about Public Law 93-638, or the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, or ISDEA. But one of the examples, or one of the ways in which there could be opportunities for expanding federal funding and making that funding much more flexible, is the expanded use of self-governance compacts and contracts under ISDEA. And there have been various proposals over the years to do that. This resource provides examples of those, describes a little bit of the benefits and potential challenges of that expansion, and provides some of the examples in terms of the ways in which those expanded uses of ISDEA have been proposed as well. And then finally, and this should come as no surprise to anyone who's been deeply involved in federal grant opportunities or challenges, but we talk a little bit about ways in which those processes could be made much more efficient. For example, we heard from tribal partners discussions about how between federal agencies where there may be opportunities to transfer funding to make it more easily available through a 638 contract, there are often complications around the interagency charges or fees or transfer limitations. And so really thinking about and discussing and providing opportunities for folks to consider how, for example, all federal agencies might be able to consolidate tribal grant programs to make them available to tribes in a much more open and sort of transparent way, and enable the passage of those grant funds perhaps through 638 contracts or compacts, as opposed to having tribes have to search out grant opportunities from a variety of different federal agencies and then respond to each federal agency's own requirements about their own grant procedures, reporting, et cetera. And so you'll see in this this particular policy memo discussion of the ways in which different policy changes and potentially legislative changes could expand and support more flexible funding for tribal climate resiliency. So I'll turn it over to Sydney to talk about our second one. I think that's the next slide.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, so then we did a bit of research looking at how tribes could kind of leverage 477 plans to address some of the barriers that we've already discussed. And so 477 plans are typically used to kind of consolidate grant programs from across up to 12 different federal agencies that relate to kind of job training, economic development, skill development, workforce training programs. But it allows tribes to really consolidate those, redesign the programs to actually meet tribal needs, and then also reduces the reporting and budgeting requirements. And so there's we identified some opportunities here for tribes to use 477 plans and align those with climate adaptation planning to better kind of build workforce and education and economic development work that supports climate adaptation needs. So there was also an amendment in 2000 that allows tribes with 477 plans to allocate up to 25% of their existing resources that they receive through 477 plans to kind of economic development and job creation efforts. And so that can create a lot of flexibility and some funding that tribes can direct to support climate adaptation needs. So I think we highlight a few case studies in the memo that you can go take a look at, but I think one is Citizen Potawatomi Nation used this kind of amendment to create a revolving loan fund to support small businesses. So that can kind of be used to support, building a climate adaptation economy. There's also alignment of climate adaptation and education plans to create, climate adaptation related education and natural resources programs at tribal colleges. And then also in general, kind of using 477 plans to integrate work happening across tribal departments. So not just education workforce departments, but also including any natural resources departments or other folks who are working on that. So we kind of highlight those and the ways that the flexibilities of 477 and the flexibilities of 638 contracting and compacting can create some ways to add flexibility to federal grant programs and reduce the strain on tribal workforce that makes it hard to address climate adaptation needs. So with that, we can go to the next slide and I'll turn it back over to Monte for a little intro.
Yeah, and as Sydney just said, I think the both with regard to 477 plans and that existing authority, and with regard to ISDEA and 638 contracting and compacting, these two resources, the second and third here, really try to provide more information for folks thinking about climate resiliency or environmental impacts and ways in which these existing resources might be leveraged to support those activities, and particularly as it relates to 638 contracting and compacting. What we heard from tribal partners and others was a desire to have more information and sort of background and understanding. And many folks are already intimately familiar with Public Law 93-638 and the contracting and compacting process. But as it relates to leveraging it for climate resiliency or for environmental resources, I think that's really where we sought to expand the application and the potential to really think about how this existing tool, which has been central to a number of tribal operations, could be utilized in this way. And so this resource provides a little bit more background and kind of a primer on self-governance contracting and compacting, especially for folks who may be a little bit less familiar with those processes, but then really tries to focus on how those resources could be utilized, particularly around natural resources, damages mitigation, or other ways in which tribal governments may prioritize that work. The only other thing I'll say here before I turn it back to Sydney is that we've also included some work done by recent law school graduates in this resource on the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act, which is also known as a TARA. That was passed in 2016, and in some ways sought to expand the authorities that tribal nations may be able to exercise over their trust resources, not so much in terms of funding, but more in terms of decision making and resource stewardship. And so you'll also see in this resource some discussion of ATARA in this context and the ability or potential utilization of that authority for tribal nations to really expand their stewardship of trust resources. Lastly, and maybe most useful in this particular resource, was the work that Sydney did to really show how tribal nations are leveraging and utilizing 638 self-governance compacting authority. And I'm going to turn it over to her to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. So we kind of looked at how 638 has been used over time. We looked at the programs that get listed as eligible for inclusion in 638 agreements, which is an annual list that gets published in the Federal Register by the Department of Interior for all departments that are not the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so we looked over all of the years that the Federal Register list has been published to kind of understand both how tribes are taking advantage of 638 and also how over time programs or departments have shifted their own kind of approach to 638 agreements. So with this first table, you can kind of see us looking at how do departments view their programs in relation to 638 agreements and kind of how open they are to entering into those. And so you can see the number of programs that have been listed over time by various departments of or various kind of offices of the Department of Interior. And I think two notable things here are, we see the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, which was listed until 2011 and is no longer listed on the Federal Register. And what's really key here is that the Federal Register list is, of course, non-exhaustive, and tribes can assume and submit requests to assume programs, services, functions, activities that are not listed. And so this kind of gives us an idea of just the ways that they shift these lists over time. And I mean, the National Park Service, you see the number of programs that they're listing as possibly eligible for inclusion in a 638 agreement really jumping in 2024. And that was after, Joint Secretarial Order 3403, which really called on agencies that manage land to enter into more co-management, co-stewardship agreements with tribes. And so they drastically increased the number of programs they were listing. And then we also have this table with the number of tribes with agreements by bureau and office listed over time. And so, we see a slight increase in National Park Service in 2024 and kind of see increases over time. I think another really key thing here is that the U.S. Geological Survey, you can kind of see in that first table, they never were listing, or were barely ever listing, any programs as eligible for inclusion in 638 agreements. They were using kind of introductory language about 638 to kind of say, we don't think we have any programs that tribes should or would want to assume. But after the Klamath Dam removal, the Yurok tribe, in spite of it not being included on the list, requested a 638 agreement to assume the data collection following the Klamath Dam removal, and assumed that from the USGS, which led to it, that program being listed for the first time on the 638 list. So I think this resource, we have, some appendices that list the different programs, and you can see all of this as like a table, and you can see the raw data, but can be interesting for exploring, maybe what programs are we not thinking about that we might want to enter into 638 contracts or compacts to take over, or what departments or bureaus and offices are no longer listed that might be ones we want to think about working with. So I think that's really the intention of this. So this is really like something to explore if you're interested in it, and has some interesting kind of patterns that you may notice. And Monte, if you want to add anything else before we...
No, the only thing I'll say about this is I think it's really, or we hope it's really helpful for folks to see kind of what has happened and what might be possible and what's going on, particularly if there are folks out there who are thinking about engaging with particular federal agencies and interior. This is a resource that could be utilized to move that forward. And I know we'll have time for question and answers later, and I know Meade will mention this, but we really hope these resources are useful, and we intend to the question here to sort of keep things updated. So if folks have questions or want to need additional resources, at least from the Native American Law Center here at the law school, we're more than willing to continue to help support this dialogue and discussion. So with that, Meade, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Monte. Thanks, Sydney. So next, I'm going to talk about our last resource developed through this project. And I'm speaking on behalf of the two folks who actually have done the work on this, who were unable to be with us today. First is Luca Greco, who was a legal fellow at the Environmental and Energy Law Program at Harvard Law School, who's working with Hannah on this. And then Noelani Villa, who's the Tribal Climate Adaptation Specialist at the UW Climate Impacts Group, has really taken this over and is the one who is maintaining it and keeping it alive and responsive and updated on our website. So the funding table is intended to do a couple things. One, it provides a comprehensive list of grant programs and funding opportunities for supporting tribal adaptation and resilience activities. So one of the things we heard is the challenge of identifying all of these different funding sources across many different agencies, federal agencies, state agencies, and programs. So this was an attempt to put them all in one place. One of the things, there are other great resources out there that list funding opportunities for tribal adaptation, like the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Project. One thing that this table does that's a little different is it really does try to daylight those barriers to funding that we heard about, and that you might have to go digging to find them. And so this is a way to see kind of immediately as you scan funding priorities what some of those challenges might be. So there are many additional columns in this table. I just kind of zoomed in on some of the ones that really highlight these barriers. So the table will tell you the funding agency and the program and the hazards that it addresses and many other things. But as you can see here, you can quickly gather, like, what is the cost share requirement? Is there a project cap? Does it require a cost benefit analysis? Is it competitive or non-competitive? Or is there a tribal set aside? Is it 638 eligible? What are the reporting requirements? We heard a lot of challenges around the burden of reporting, for example. So we described that in here. So this table is available on the Climate Impacts Group website. You can search by the type of funding, the environmental hazard you're concerned about, some of the barriers that are present. This is, Monte mentioned, we want many of these to be responsive and living. This is very much still a living table, and we're still refining it and updating it. And so all of these tools are available, again, on this project webpage, and we hope people will be in touch if they see things that need to be updated as they use them. So this project was actually terminated along with the Northwest Climate Resilience Collaborative back in May of 2025. So we had wanted to get this out much earlier, but we lost our funding, but we were committed to getting it done. And so we apologize it's a little later than we'd hoped, but we're glad to have finished it and gotten it out to you. I will note that this work does continue through some other programs. We were lucky to be able to leverage this program to get another large federal grant that is still effective today, that is funding a small grants program and technical assistance program for Washington coastal tribes. We co-designed the small grants program with tribal partners in response to many of the things that we heard in those earlier listening sessions in the 2024 report. So the small grants program is non-competitive. It has a very simple application process. It is very much, the tribes can determine for themselves what resilience means for them and describe how these projects contribute to their own priorities and definitions of resilience. The reporting requirements are also very streamlined. So we did as much as we possibly could to try to streamline this, and it's federal funding, and so we're encountering some of those barriers too in administering it. But this is attempting to both be responsive to tribes' needs for, in this case, small grants that can help be a foundation to build upon for larger adaptation funding needs, and also a pilot program really to demonstrate what it would look like to do trust-based philanthropy, like really tribally responsive and driven granting. And so we're learning a lot as we do this, and we're looking to share what we have learned with federal and state and other funding sources, sponsors, when we're done with this work. We also have a technical assistance program that goes along with this, both for the grants and more broadly for adaptation. And all of this work, I introduced Noelani Villa a little earlier, who is our tribal climate adaptation specialist at Meade Climate Impacts Group. She was hired as part of this grant and this program, and so we have a full-time specialist to assist with the program and technical assistance. So this work carries on sort of in a somewhat different program, but we're glad to be able to continue with the work. I also want to end by, again, acknowledging we really hope that these tools and resources are going to be useful to and used by tribes and non-tribal partners in addressing these common barriers around funding for tribal climate adaptation. And we also recognize that a lot has changed since we began work on this over a year ago now. And so we know things are continuing to evolve, and we just ask that you please reach out and keep in touch if you see a need for anything to be updated, or if you have any questions or need any assistance in using these resources. I know we're all very happy to respond and make sure that these are useful to everybody, and their usefulness is maintained over time. And with that, we would like to thank all of our tribal partners for lending their experience and expertise and trust to this work. We hope that we've delivered on that and that this will be useful. And I also want to, on behalf of the whole team, thank everybody for attending